And Jim is the guy who is primarily responsible for the Chuck Manoli Scholarship and the Chuck Manoli Lecture Series. He and Joe O'Connor got the ball rolling, and they enlisted my help, and we brought in Mike Walsh, and that was the Gang of Four for a while, and we got this thing going. And the thing you always worry about is sustainability, and with Chuck, we had no problem. He has sustainability, and he's influenced more people than any teacher I know, and I know a lot of people in the profession. And I see a lot of young faces out there, and I'm just sorry you did not have the chance to have Mr. Manoli in your class, as your history instructor, because he was simply sensational, quiet, measured, poised, and just limitlessly bright. And we all owe him a great debt. He was like it's like he ran an aid station. I read a lot about military history. I always think of these metaphors. He was like a surgeon running an aid station on the front lines. And we were the patients. We were the soldiers out fighting. And we'd come to him when we were hurt. And we were crazy. We didn't know much. We were fighting without helmets. And you'd go see Chuck. And we weren't, by the way, we weren't the greatest generation. That generation of the 60s, we were probably the lost generation more than the greatest generation. And Chuck helped us to find ourselves. And I remember one time I came up to St. Vincent, years after I graduated. My nephew, Christian, was a student here, and like Mr. Stork, was in the Peace Corps after graduation. But he started out here, as I did, in a pretty rocky way. And the first time my wife and I came up here to St. Vincent, we started to look for Christian. And I went over to Chuck and I asked him, and he said, well, I don't think he wants to see you because he's not doing too well. Chuck had looked up his transcript and he was failing everything but one. When we found him, he said he was putting too much attention into that one course. So the next year we came up, he greeted us, called us beforehand, took us to his room, took us around the campus. But the Sula experience was going to his room because he had a picture of Chuck Manoli on his bulletin board. And I thought, I've never seen anything like that. And Chuck was a guy who turned him around and turned him on to intellectual history, something that he's been a specialist at for all his life. I first ran into Chuck. I always have to tell a couple of Chuck stories, and then we'll get to Mr. Stork. In class, and this was Chuck's second year here. He taught here, by the way, over 50 years, counting in the seminary and counting a couple of years after retirement when he came back and just taught one course. And he hardly ever missed the class. I mean, you just didn't miss a Manoli class because Manoli was always there. And sick or healthy, snow or clear days, he was there, and he was there for us. But the thing was, we had no idea what the class was about when we were sitting there. Absolutely no idea. Because he didn't lecture. It was mysterious. And here was this guy with a lot of poise sitting up in front of us, a handsome guy, a rugged-looking guy. We all knew he was an athlete. And some of us were, and that attracted us to him. And he started to talk about, this was in European history. And by the way, it didn't matter what Chuck course you took, they were all the same. And except for the exams. And they were always pretty rough, but he was just one of the toughest graders at the college. People didn't realize that. But it was all about fascinating books that he read. And that's what he did to us. He turned us on to the great works, of the human family, if you will. And we were sitting in class, and how do you connect with a guy like this that's so bright? The only guy that would talk to him was Joe O'Connor. But Joe would talk to anybody. So we were a little intimidated. Joe wasn't. He had some context. He knew how to conduct a conversation. And Joe said, this guy hangs out at the shack. And I've had a couple conversations over there with him, and he's a great guy. Why don't we all go over there? So Boomer and I and Joe went over there, and I said to Boomer afterwards, if we're ever going to connect with this guy, we got a big problem. We haven't read anything, and he's read everything. So we got to go out and start reading things. So all of a sudden we're in the library, and all of a sudden we're actually buying books. Imagine that, college students buying books that aren't required in the classroom. God forbid. And that's how you got to know him. And he took us from there into life lessons and became a great transformer of human beings. And it's so appropriate that we have Joe Stork here tonight, because he is a transformer of human beings. Now, here's a person. Joe was here 2 years before. He came here 2 years before I did. I didn't know Joe too well. I knew his brother very well. We played sports together, and Jerry, and he's a great guy. But everybody knew of Joe Stork because he was just not just a Manoli guy. He was just a really bright guy, and he was unusually mature, and he really knew where he was, where a lot of us didn't. And be mature beyond his years, but still was a gracious, outgoing personality as well. And it's so appropriate that he's here, not just because he connects with Manoli, because Manoli helped to change his life, because he is a transformer of human beings, of entire nations. Here is a human being. Now, I've read his Vita, and I'm not going to go through the long Vita, the arm-long bibliography and things like that. But what impressed me when I read it was this. Here is a person that's dedicated his entire life to peace on earth, to the promotion of peace on earth. There is no more laudable cause than that. None. He's done it assiduously, he's done it persistently, he's done it judiciously, and he's done it to great acclaim. And if this lecture were held tonight in New York City, we'd have 6,000 people here. He's that well known, he's that highly respected. After St. Vincent, he went on to the Peace Corps. He served in Turkey for 2 years. He then came back to New York City. He's from New York, from Long Island, and he attended Columbia University, International Affairs, and got a master's degree in International Affairs. And currently, he's a deputy head of he's a division head at an organization called Human Watch. And they're one of the great organizations in the world today, globally, promoting peace and amity between nations. His specialty, it's the hottest spot on earth, of course, the Middle East and North Africa. And his focus is on his entire life focus is on the violation of human rights by nation states, armed groups, and armed gangs. He's worked on the ground in Iraq. He's worked on the ground in Israel. He's worked on the ground in Palestine. That's how these guys work. They go out and do field studies. They put themselves right at the point of the spear, in danger too. And then they come back to Washington and they publish. What a life, action, publication. And you're doing it all for a good cause. He's published 4 or 5 books, one of the earliest ones on the Middle East and the energy crisis. He's published dozens of articles. I'm not going to give you all the articles, but just listen to this. These are just some of the themes that he's addressed. You talk about timely. What you're going to hear tonight is inordinately timely. The Kurdish revolt, torture in Sinai, the failure of democracy in Algiers, civil rights in Bahrain, the Persian Gulf War, the Middle East and the energy crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, and Soviet policy in Iraq. Joe Stork.
Thank you, Donnie. Thank you all. I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be here. How to start? I mean, I guess first for the video. This is for Jim. This is for Boomer. I really wish you could have been here tonight with us, but I'm dedicating this talk to you. Get better soon. Yeah, I mean, we drove up. Priscilla and I drove up from Washington today, and we came up to the Breezewood connection. Still looks the same, pretty much as it did, 50 years ago. I mean, it's all bigger, of course, and then we got on the turnpike. We got off at Bedford and we drove 30 all the way in, and it was just of course, a marvelous day to be doing that. Sun, cloud, dapple the sky and the trees, still lots of color and so forth. And, it was pretty nostalgic and so forth. And then coming over the hill in the same way it used to be, seeing the campus, the basilica, and so forth. Reminded me why we used to call St. Vincent's, when I was going there, I don't know if still today, the Princeton of the Alleghenies. Sort of in jest, of course, but, I guess I also want to say, well, I should say, first of all, I'm really glad I came back because I finally got the bracelet that will enable me to have a glass of wine on this campus. So anyway, thanks for that. No, I think, this is kind of historic. I'm not in academia, but I'm certainly not aware of any other place where a professor's students have gotten together the way this group of people have done. People like Joe and Donnie and Jim and the rest of you all who are working on this committee. And first of all, had the idea to put this, something like this together, and then to not just a one-shot, one-time affair, but actually to keep it going year after year. So it's really with tremendous humility, and I frankly didn't recognize the guy that Donnie was just describing there. I don't know, I think he was talking about my brother, actually. So I arrived at St. Vincent's in the fall of 1960. It was a big political year, Kennedy versus Nixon. This was, I don't know if it still is, kind of doubt it, but this was Democrat country then. This was, workers and coals and steel and all the rest. So we were smothered with Democratic Party stuff, even, to the extent that this was reflected in campus politics. So, what was a budding contrarian to do but join the Young Republicans? So I know it's hard to believe, given what soon transpired, but anyway, we did. I think all three of the Young Republicans on campus we were all from Brooklyn and Queens. Somehow it happened that way, but it wasn't long before things changed. The world was changing, and we changed too. After all, that's why we were here. I was an English major. When I told Jim that, he sort of, I think the first write-up that the PR house put out about my talk, they had me as a history major. I said, no, I'm an English. He said, that's okay, you can still come. So I took as much history as I could. And, it was really, I can't say any more than Donnie already said about the what I'll call the Manoli experience. It really was exceptional. It had a big influence on me. Not only Chuck, of course, but this place, the place that it was. Father Chris Fullman, Jim Krenner, Father Maynard, Sam Astorino, Professor Shearer, but Chuck Manoli was sort of right up there as a very important source for us. When I was here, and I think it was in my freshman year, so I think it was the fall of 1960 or spring of 1961. Although I was talking with Brother Norman earlier, and he had a different year. We were talking about the same thing, but he thought maybe it was a year later. In any case, I was working with the Review, the student newspaper, and at the time, this was an all-white student body, except we had 2 exchange students from Kenya, if I recall correctly. And what happened, and I think this was very early after I got here. Anyway, one of these students went into Latrobe to get a haircut, and he was refused by the barber to get a haircut. So the Review, the newspaper, took this up. We're going to make a big deal about this. We did, and the college stepped in and suspended the newspaper, and it became sort of a classic town gown, little struggle that went on there. But it kind of, and I remember Chris Fullman at the time saying there was a big assembly about, it became really it enveloped the whole campus, and Chris Fullman get up there and said, and of course the administration was saying, don't rock the boat. That seemed to be the watchword, don't rock the boat. And Chris Fullman got up there and said, a boat that's not rocking is in a stagnant pond. And that was so powerful, and that's something I'll remember as long as I live. The other thing I remember about the review, I have to mention it, as there was a print shop. I don't know if it's still on the campus. There was a print shop, and a guy named Frank Lamondola, who was the father of Wally Lamondola, who was in my class. Frank Lamondola ran the print shop, and we would go down and set the headlines for the newspaper by hand, letter by letter, space by space. So it was a real, when you think of where you are today and where I've been, sort of from Gutenberg to, Microsoft Office. Anyway, it's been, what a long, strange trip it's been. After, when I got out of college, I went into the Peace Corps, and I was, the Peace Corps said, would you like to go to Turkey? I said, wow. I didn't ask to go to any particular place in particular, and I thought, fantastic. And I'm sure that, part of that was my, abiding interest in history, that part of, that owed a lot to Chuck. So I was in Turkey from 1964 to 1966. I came back to New York. I got to say, it was a different country I came back to. This was the year of, Vietnam, Mississippi Summer and the Civil Rights Movement, the marches down south, the Vietnam War movement. And at Columbia University, I became part of a group of return volunteers, mostly, who we came together. We formed a group called Committee of Return Volunteers, which were very much part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. I was there at Columbia University during that uprising in 1968, in the spring of 1968, when there was also Paris and Prague and several other places were happening. And then I do remember also going that summer to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And I think until recently, that was the last time I saw Chuck and Anita, because on the way back, I and my comrades, we stopped to spend the night at sort of a way station in Latrobe. And we saw Chuck and Anita then. It was quite, we had tales to tell, and nobody was more interested in hearing about them than those two. Out of that work with the Committee of Return Volunteers, there was sort of a small caucus of people who had worked in Middle Eastern countries, and out of that came something we call the Middle East Research and Information Project, and we started a magazine called Middle East Report, a magazine that still exists today, which was kind of dedicated to the proposition that, if you talked about the Middle East in those days, and it's been overtaken by other events today, but then it was all Arab versus Israeli. That was kind of the paradigm. And we wanted to complicate that a little bit. We wanted to, insist that there were other things going on there. Hey, what about oil? We got involved, so we did this magazine over a decade that included, civil war in Lebanon, a revolution, maybe the last major, mass revolution that I can think of, actually, in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. We were the witnesses to and documenting those events. And we were one of the few outlets, I'm proud to say today even, that would talk about events like the Iranian Revolution in a way that was not fawningly uncritical or adamantly opposed to it, but actually, with some strong measure of sympathy with the revolutionary impulse, but also, a lot of concern about where the new rulers were leading things. So I moved to Human Rights Watch in the beginning of 1996, so almost 20 years ago. Human Rights Watch is an organization, it's an international organization headquartered in New York. I've been working out of the Washington office. Now, it's interesting, I was reflecting, when I was at St. Vincent, or for that matter, when I was at Columbia, a career in human rights was not, it was not on the table. I mean, there were no courses, there were no programs. It was only in a class like Chuck's that you even would encounter the term human rights. But today, practically any college, university of any size. There are courses either in the politics department or the anthropology department or wherever. Practically every significant law school has a human rights clinic as part of it. There's been a growth in a professionalization of the field that, has in part resulted in the kinds of young colleagues that I'm able to work with today. It's quite marvelous. So what do we do in Human Rights Watch? I thought maybe I'd spend a little bit of time talking about that and why. But just sort of one aspect, one piece of the history, I guess, is just, and one reason I think why, back in 1964 and 1969, human rights was just, there weren't courses, there weren't programs, and so forth. I mean, the treaties that sort of form the basis for the work that we do, the international treaties like the Convention Against Torture, for instance, the various conventions against discrimination and so forth, the International Covenant on Political Civil Rights and so forth, they only were developed in the mid-1960s, and they only came into force after a requisite number of states had ratified them in the mid-1970s. So it was really only then, and you may recall, some of you at least, back in the 1970s, how there was a sort of a taking up of the human rights issues, particularly under the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter himself. But in the days before that, in the months, years before that, it started actually in Congress. Congress was the seedbed of committees and committee hearings raising these issues with regard to U.S. policies in Vietnam and Chile and other parts of the world. So that the treaties only come into force starting in the mid-1970s. So you have the International Covenants of Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and then other treaties like the Convention Against Torture, Discrimination Against Women, and so forth, that are all kind of embodied in those core covenants, get articulated, elaborated, and so forth. And I think one important thing to point out is that, so when we talk about these treaty obligations today, we're not talking about things that were written by Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. We're talking about things that were negotiated by governments. And when you talk about the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, for instance, they're negotiated by people in our military establishment along with their counterparts in other military establishments. So we're trying to encourage compliance with norms and standards that were developed, by statesmen, by politicians, political leaders, military leaders, and so forth. What they took to be at the time kind of best practices. So treaty obligations were one thing, but again, and here's where the history kind of gets interesting, there was the Helsinki Accords of 1975. So Helsinki was in 1975 was the culmination of years and years of negotiation, basically between the East Bloc and the West Bloc, the Western Bloc, okay? So Cold War, years of the Cold War, sort of a movement in the 70s towards some kind of détente. And the Helsinki Accords, which were not a treaty, so they didn't have the force of law. But what they did was, one thing they did was set the borders resulting from from borders that had not been formally recognized going back to the end of World War II, which was something the Soviet Union was very interested in doing in terms of establishing its, sphere of influence in legal, diplomatic terms. But there were other parts of the Helsinki Accords. For instance, there was the basket, the so-called basket that dealt with the borders. Okay, it settled those border questions. And then there was a basket dealing with human rights. And so it talked about freedom of movement. And this was a time when the big freedom of movement issue, at least in the West, was the ability of Jews in the Soviet Union to exit the Soviet Union. They were not able to do that at the time. Many of them wanted to move to Israel. Many moved to the States, other countries. So that was those kinds of issues were kind of framed in the Helsinki Accords, but simply as kind of an understanding. The language was participating states in the Helsinki Accords will respect, this right, that right, and so forth. And what you saw then was something quite marvelous. You saw, particularly in the Eastern Bloc, people like Andrei Sakharov, for instance, in the Soviet Union, a Soviet physicist, starting their own little Helsinki committees, okay, and saying, okay, you, in this case, Soviet Union, you signed this, okay, you signed on, you said you're going to respect freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and so forth, and we're going to hold you to it. Now, of course, what happened was many of them spent many years in prison, in exile, and so forth, so it wasn't a happy experience, but there was a fermentation that went on in many places in Eastern Bloc countries, not just the Soviet Union. And it's actually what gave rise to my organization, which began under the name of Helsinki Watch. So it was a group of people that came together in New York, mainly people associated with the publishing industry. So their kind of big issue naturally was sort of free expression. And the idea being watch the compliance of the signatory states. And initially, so this was in 1978, in the late 70s, early 80s, the focus was kind of more on violations by Soviet Union, East Bloc countries. But then a sort of a sister organization started in Washington called America's Watch, and basically using the same approach, same methodologies and so forth, was looking at what was going on particularly in countries allied to the U.S. So what was happening in El Salvador, what was happening in Central America, in the Southern Cone countries, and so forth. So it was establishing very early on the idea that human rights is something that's, it's intrinsic, it's universal, it shouldn't be politicized, okay? It's not something to be used as part of the Cold War, which of course it was. It was very much by all parties. But our organization and other groups like Amnesty established very early on the idea of impartiality, the idea of looking at violations by all parties to a conflict and so forth. So I joined Human Rights Watch, as I said, at the beginning of '96. By June of '96, I found myself in Bahrain, a country to which I was not invited, a country which had refused my requests for visas. And so I was at the time, and to some extent today, but less so today, if you were a gringo, if you were a white guy, dressed not too shabbily, you could go and get a visa at the airport, because kind of assumed you were a businessman or something. So I did, and I spent about a week kind of on the ground, somewhat on the ground, kind of. Ended up meeting some very remarkable people I'm still very close friends with. Ended up writing that first book of mine that came out of Human Rights Watch. A lot of the work we do, if you go on our website, you'll see it's very short, 2-3 pages, reacting to, for instance, we just put out a statement yesterday about the Saudi warplanes bombing Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in northern Yemen. So it's very quick reaction and stuff like that. And in that way, we're kind of like a human rights wire service. We're kind of like a news service, right? And so to tie it back to the history again, let's say journalism is the first draft, okay? Well, so we're part of that first drafting, but trying to get our angle on it, our take on it, into the reporting from the get-go. But then there's the deep dive, what we call the investigative work, the second draft maybe, much more definitive reports that sometimes are over 100 pages, with the footnotes and all that. Increasingly, this is work where we also use videographers, so we will record some of the interviews that we're doing with witnesses or victims. So if you go on our website today and look at a report, even a short report, very often, increasingly, you'll see a link to a short, 3 or 4 minute video that really kind of encapsulates the message. But we're very much trying to reach the people who are not going to read past at most past the headline or the first paragraph of a press statement. And we're using new tools, too, that are possible in this digital age. So we use a lot of satellite imagery, for instance, when we do reports on some I've been involved in recently in Iraq, where we're looking at destruction of villages. Okay, so we're able to get sat imagery of villages as they were before date X, and then how they are, 3 months later, after the militias have moved in. Very, very useful, obviously, in terms of being able to very graphically demonstrate the kind of what perhaps words of victims can't alone convey, but give you, give it right to you, right in the face, so to speak. So what do? We look at, as I said, indicated before, when we say what are human rights, we're looking at, well, let me step back and say, I think human rights for me boils down into two things, really. One is the golden rule, do unto others, okay? The second is not by any means necessary, okay? So no matter how just the cause, no matter how important the goal, you can't use anything you want to get there. So you can't use torture, for instance, under any circumstances, okay? Even though we know out there are arguments how useful torture might be in a ticking bomb situation and so forth. You can't do it. I mean, not to say it isn't done, it is done, but the point is that's a bright red line there. Same with targeting civilians in wartime, or using indiscriminate warfare to basically terrorize civilians. These are things, again, we didn't make this stuff up. We're simply saying this is what you states, came together in 1949, in 1977, and so forth, and laid out as the rules of the game for you. Now it gets complicated, okay, when you deal with asymmetric warfare, when you deal with people who are not fighting in uniforms and so forth. I don't want to suggest it's, the line is always so clear, it's always so black and white, but the principle is very clear. So some of the investigations that I've been involved in, I mentioned Bahrain. I've done work in Gaza, in Iran, so about 10 years ago, 2005, 2006, looking at what was happening in terms of the Hamas armed movement, firing these indiscriminate rockets into Israel, into Israeli towns, which, so prima facie war crime. But then also looking at the way the Israeli military was responding, the kind of artillery they were using in very populated areas and so forth. And again, so making a point to look at all parties, when you're dealing with an armed conflict, which increasingly is what we're dealing with in the Middle East, looking at what all the parties are doing. We do this in Syria. We've done numerous reports on what's been going on in Syria since well before 2011, but certainly since that uprising started then. And again, we look not just at what the government of Syria is doing to its population, we're also looking at the behavior of the armed groups that are fighting. And I don't mean just the bad guys like ISIS. I'm talking about, the ones that get the support, sometimes of the US, but of Turkey, of our allies like Saudi Arabia, and so forth. Probably one of the highlights of my experience, I'll mention two. One is I happened to fly into Cairo on January 25th, 2011, which was the first day of the uprising against Mubarak. It was purely by chance. I was going there because we had been working on a report on torture by the Egyptian security forces, and specifically the slice we were taking was the failure of the Egyptian prosecutor general to actually investigate these cases. Okay, so there were no prosecutions, there were no criminal investigations of the security forces who were responsible for these outrages. So that was what the report was about. As it happened, that's what the uprising was about too. I mean, no, it was about more than that. But the trigger was what had happened in Alexandria a few months before, when the police, two security forces, savagely beat to death in broad daylight a young Egyptian man of 20-odd years. And the beating was bad enough. The security forces initially put out that he was, he had died because he had tried to swallow the drugs they were trying to, a bag of drugs they were trying to confiscate and so forth. And then it turned out, hey, there were photos. There were, phone photos of this guy after the police got done with him. And they went viral, of course. And then there was the cover-up. So, it was, and January 25th happened to be National Police Day in Egypt. So it was, extraordinary timing, purely coincidental for me to be there, but probably the most exciting days of my life, ever since the Democratic National Convention, in any case. Of course, the Egypt story has become much less happy. I am, by the way, planning to end in time to allow some questions, because I'm really actually looking forward to that opportunity. So please feel free to pick up on anything I've said or anything I haven't said. I suppose the other project that was most interesting, I did a report that came out in 2002 on Palestinian suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. And through my work and in Middle East Report over the years, I had become known as I had a reputation as kind of a Palestine solidarity kind of guy. And here I was putting out this report. And I asked, I volunteered to do this precisely because I felt I had the credit to do it, and because I was so angry, frankly, with the kind of tactics that my Palestinian friends, quote unquote, were using. I really wanted to do this report. And we did. It came out. I can't say it stopped the suicide bombings right away. It didn't, and there were a lot of reasons why that's a very unusual phenomenon in that theater, in the Palestine theater today. But I think we had some impact, particularly on other people, Palestinians and Israelis, but Palestinians in particular, and people in Egypt and other places for whom the cause is, very, very important, in how they saw those kind of tactics. Again, getting back to that, you can't be any means necessary. That kind of philosophy, that kind of approach, results in these kinds of crimes. And then we did a similar report on what was going on in Iraq in the 2004-2005 period. I was not part of that directly, but then, we thought, we've done these reports, we do these, whenever there's some outrage, we'll put out a press statement expressing our condemnation and so forth. And, you kind of have to do it, but because some people are out there counting how many press releases you put out on what the Palestinians do and how many you put out on what the Israelis do and this kind of thing. We have to deal, that's the world we live in. But we realized, and we would have, in the research we did for that report I did, we met with Hamas people, Islamic Jihad, we met with the perpetrator people. We got their views, in fact, it was a very important part of the report because we got them basically explaining why they felt it was okay for them, to do this, and then saying, well, you know what? You could end up in front of a war crimes court someday for this kind of stuff. But I think the result was we had some influence on sort of the environment, and as far as it went amongst Palestinians and more broadly Arabs doing human rights work, where they kind of said, yeah, we haven't spoken out about this, and it's really good that somebody did. And then we started a multi-year project that didn't involve reports. It involved meetings, advocacy meetings, going to practically every country, and that was a time when we could still get into most countries, and meeting with religious leaders, meeting with editors, columnists, in other words, people who shape opinion. And that was an opinion that, by and large, in the Arab world was very supportive of these kinds of attacks by Palestinians. And we were saying, hey, this kind of enabling is, this is a real problem. And again, I think what really turned things around, to the extent that things got turned around, was what was going on in Iraq, where, the victims were not Israeli Jews, the victims were other Iraqis primarily. And that sort of that's sort of, I think that's really what kind of shifted the mood, the attitudes. But I think also, it was a very, I'm very proud of that work, of that campaign we did. Let me just say that, I've talked about how human rights work and human rights is non-political, but in a sense it's not apolitical either. I mean, what we do has to look at, all parties, so in that sense it's impartial. But after all, what are human rights? Rights are claims on power. They're what people demand of political authorities and of coercive institutions generally. So the human rights, we're talking mainly about states, okay, governments, but we could be talking about a university. We could be talking about a religious institution, a hospital, whatever. I mean, but we're talking about human rights. We're talking about the coercive power that states have and how they use that power. Of course, they have it, and the idea is not to take it away from them, but to make sure that it's used in a way that comports with these international standards. So, claims on power. And then what we saw through history is an expansion of those claims. So what was first the claims of nobles became the claims of free men, it became the claims of property owners, it became the claims of white people, it became the claims of men generally. Finally, it also included women. And we've seen that steady expansion over the centuries. And we know it from our own experience, historical experience, I think, but we also have seen it in many, many other parts of the world as well. In fits and starts, very often, with setbacks continually, but that's been, I think, a fair characterization of the trajectory. And then there's sort of what we're part of, I think, sort of the articulation of what rights are and the formulation of rights in law, so the development of these treaties, for instance, and things like the Geneva Conventions, a political process. And then after you have those laws, there's the implementation, of course, the protection, the enforcement, and that's where it gets tricky, is the enforcement. These have to be self-operational in a sense. I mean, you're counting on the state that signed the treaty to actually comply with the obligations in the treaty, and that's, of course, where the problem lies. But I think that's how I see, in many ways, the link between what I did before I worked with Human Rights Watch and then my work with Human Rights Watch. In a sense, human rights is about the possibility of practicing politics peacefully. And we saw that in the Middle East in terms of the emergence of human rights organizations and activism in many countries like Egypt, like Tunisia, like Palestine, like Iraq. The main actors were people who had been in political parties or would have ordinarily been in political parties, but there was no space for political parties, and sort of human rights provided a safe space to do this work. And yes, some of the work they did was politicized. Some of it was hardly impartial. But I think there was an acculturation there, a learning there, so today we have, bodies of people in many of those countries where there is an appreciation of the non-political and impartial nature of human rights. And we saw after some of the uprisings happened, the first president of Tunisia was a human rights activist, someone I had met in Washington when he was in exile in the 1990s. One of the first prime ministers in Libya had been a human rights. He's no longer prime minister, of course, that's another story. But there's been an expanding consensus, I think it's fair to say, around these internationally recognized political, civil, economic rights. And that's been a major component, I think, of the sort of dialectic and logic that's helped shape global politics over, really, I think since the middle of the last century, since around 1950 or so, but particularly in the last quarter century. I think it's safe to say our impact, where have we been able to, where our reporting and investigations have brought about some measure of change, positive change, has been in what I'd call soft areas. So in Persian Gulf states, for instance, where half, or in some cases well over half of the population are migrant workers with virtually no rights, and really bonded labor, in effect. These are issues we've been pushing on, and I think we've had a little bit of success because, first of all, they don't represent existential threats to those governments. Like when we say you shouldn't put your own citizens in jail, they don't listen to us on that. Their own citizens are in jail in great numbers. But when we talk about the need for, having regulations for when construction workers can work in the middle of the day in the summertime, and they can't be transported to work in open back trucks that turn over on the highway and this kind of thing. Very, very concrete, nitty-gritty things. We do get somewhere. The other reason we get somewhere is that we're dealing with corporations, and corporations, unlike states, care about their reputations. So if you go to a construction company or a museum like the Louvre, which has setting up a new museum in Abu Dhabi, for instance. Again, I don't want to suggest that they're snap to it and say, what can we do? But they're much more receptive to pressures, frankly, and campaigns than these states tend to be. Look, I think, of course, today we're looking at challenges that I couldn't have imagined, certainly not 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. We have this phenomenon, this so-called Islamic State phenomenon. Our operation, we kind of refer to our operation as name and shame. You cannot shame these people. No, I'm serious. They are advertising. They are disseminating videos of their horrors and the outrages. So, anything we do it's just sort of playing into their, I'll be quite honest, we haven't figured out how to deal with that. And it's a tremendous, not that I think they represent the wave of the future, not at all, but I do think we haven't figured out how to sort of address that problem. What Prime Minister Merkel in Germany, talking about the Nazis, but she referred to it as a civilizational breach, and I think that's kind of very captures what we're seeing out there. And then on the other hand, we see the results or the responses of states. So we see what happened in Egypt, for instance, and one of my colleagues likes to point out that Sisi, the name of the president, is ISIS spelled backwards. But there was a coup, a military coup. It was popular. It had a lot of popular support, but at the end of the day, it was a military coup. It's a government that's unrelentingly hostile to the very idea not to the idea of human rights, proclaims its dedication, but in practice, reinstating the worst kinds of authoritarianism that we saw over the previous 30, 40 years, mass incarceration, torture. Recent case last week was a young man who was brought up on charges of, insulting the state or something because on his Facebook he had put a picture of President Sisi with Mickey Mouse ears. I mean, that can get you a 3-year jail term in Egypt today. And then, at the armed conflicts in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and now in Yemen, it's really tough. We know what we have to do. We know what we can do well. It's something we'll continue to do. But I won't. I'm trying to be honest with you here. It's also an enormous challenge. I think the other thing we are doing, though, and again, this sort of goes back to what we learned how to do here at St. Vincent, which, in terms of writing well, in terms of documenting, in terms of challenging, partisan accounts, we're helping to shape the narrative of what's happening. In my case, happening in the Middle East, with the actions of various states and armed groups, and with the roles that outside powers like the United States, the European Union countries, and so forth are playing. I'm going to end with a quote that I found recently, and it made me think of Chuck, actually. It's by Eduardo Galeano, who's a Uruguayan activist historian who passed away recently, and it was the epigram in a novel by Colin McCann, and it says, "No history is mute, no matter how much they own it, break it, and lie about it. Human history refuses to shut its mouth. Despite deafness and ignorance, the time that was continues to tick inside the time that is." And then finally, just in terms of, how I see my role in this, David Carr, the wonderful New York Times journalist who passed away earlier this year, he once told a class, "I now inhabit a life I don't deserve. The trick is to be grateful and hope the caper doesn't end anytime soon." Thank you.